Hello, and welcome to Bite Size Legal, where we tackle legal issues one bite at a time. My name is Drew Jenkins, and I'm an attorney licensed in the states of Georgia and Alabama. And today, we're going to take a quick bite out of LLCs, or limited liability companies. We started a series about starting your new business to ring in the new year. We've already covered sole proprietorships, partnerships, limited partnerships, and spent a little while talking about corporations. And just as we have covered these entities in order of when they first appeared, LLCs are generally next up. So the LLC, as you may be aware, is an alternative entity type, and it's a very popular one today. It also tends to be one of the newer ones you can choose. So the first thing to point out is that it is called a limited liability company. It is not a corporation, unless you choose it to be, and we'll talk about this. So a limited liability company is, like all the other limited liability entities that we've discussed so far, which really is just a corporation, has to be filed with the state. So unlike your general partnerships, your limited partnerships, and your sole proprietorship, if you want to receive the benefits of an LLC, you have to register with the state. Typically, this will involve a name reservation, followed by either, your state might call it different things, articles of formation, a certificate of formation. The important thing is that you are not incorporating. It doesn't make any sense to create a limited liability corporation because, as we previously discussed, the corporation is the original limited liability entity. And the reason for the LLC is that, as we've also discussed, corporations have corporate formalities. And they actually have a lot of design that is built directly into them by law and by a very long history of case law. So what we needed was, we recognized that we wanted to incentivize entrepreneurship, but we didn't want the baggage necessarily of a corporation. So how can we provide limited liability to a very small company, or even to one person, to operate without the fear of losing their house if everything goes wrong? And the answer to that turns out to be the LLC. And in fact, the LLC only exists as a creature of state law. And this is important because we've covered how partnerships are taxed. We've covered how corporations are taxed. And you'll be surprised to know that at the federal level, there is no LLC, which means that when you form your LLC, or as you're operating your LLC, you actually have the choice on how you want to be taxed. If you are a sole owner, you can actually be what's called a disregarded entity, which means for federal law tax purposes, we're going to entirely ignore the LLC as a separate entity and just run it all on your personal income return. You can choose to be taxed as a partnership, or you can even choose to be taxed as a corporation to take advantage of some of the corporate tax deductions that may exist. This also means that it is possible, but you have to be very careful with it, to create an LLC that is taxed as a corporation that then makes an S election. We're going to cover this later, but you can create something that's called an SLLC, and depending on your circumstances, it may be a very good thing to create one. So with all of this flexibility, why would you create anything other than an LLC? And the answer to that is very simple. The other entity types have extremely long case law, right? They have been around for a long time. A lot of people are very comfortable with them. Because of the flexibility in LLCs, if they're designed improperly, it can create a lot of problems. And if you are trying to grow a very large entity, because of the flexibility of the LLC and because it can be designed incorrectly, you can incur significant legal bills in having potential investors review your LLC documents. Again, if you're a partnership, we know how it's going to operate, for the most part. And we know case law is going to create certain, depending on your state, unwaivable duties between the owners, between the partners. We know if you're a corporation, again, extremely long case law that tells us how you operate and how decisions have to be made. With LLCs, not quite so much. You have a lot of latitude, and that latitude means there's a lot more due diligence. But this flexibility also means if you're a company of one, you can get limited liability. Or if you decide that you want to have a company with 1,000 members and you want to give different members different rights, you want to split profits and losses separately, you want to split your depreciation schedule separately, you are totally free to do that in an LLC. So they can get rather complicated rather fast, but the flexibility has a lot that goes for it. So one thing to point out, another bite, is that the owners of an LLC are referred to as members. Right? We're not calling them partners because, remember, you're not really partners for partnership law purposes unless you choose to be. And you're not shareholders unless you choose to be. So we generally refer to owners as members. LLCs by default are going to be taxed as a partnership unless you're a sole member, a single member LLC or the sole owner, at which point you will generally be treated as a disregarded entity. So just like a sole proprietorship, only with limited liability. You're treated as partners, which means that multiple members in an LLC are going to be treated as owning a percentage interest in the company. Now, obviously, if you choose to be taxed as a corporation, you can create something that is the equivalent of shares or stock, and you can run it that way in your books. So it seems pretty good. So what do we call the operating document? The document that tells us how the company relates to itself and how it makes decisions and how it relates to its owners. We know that in a partnership, we refer to that as a partnership agreement. In a corporation, we refer to it as bylaws. For a LLC, we refer to that as our either company agreement or operating agreement, depending on where your jurisdiction is. But again, it is the equivalent of the bylaws or the partnership agreement. It simply says how the company is to operate, how decisions are to be made, and how the company relates back to its owners. And there's a lot more to cover about LLCs, but let's review our big bites. One is the LLC is kind of the new kid on the block. The LLC is eminently flexible. It does not exist at federal law, so you get to choose whether to be taxed as a partnership or a corporation if you have more than one member. And you need to form it just like a corporation with the state registered name reservation. Your operating agreement is referred to as an operating agreement or as a company agreement. I hope you found this useful, or if not, at least enjoyable. And if you have any comments, feel free to leave them below. If you're in WeChat, leave them in Thread, and look forward to seeing you next week.